We're used to thinking of weapons as tanks, missiles, and assault rifles. It's straightforward: explosions, destruction, smoke, and noise. But there are types of weapons that are far more terrifying. So terrifying, in fact, that we don't talk about them openly. There are no parades for them, no demonstrations of power, no news bulletins with the proud phrase, "We've developed something new." In fact, even discussing these technologies can make politicians and scientists visibly nervous. After all, it's one thing to argue about whose missile has the longest range. It's another thing entirely to debate whether someone can manipulate your mind, control your weather, or even tamper with your very own DNA. It sounds like the plot of a cheap sci-fi movie, right? The strange part is that these sci-fi topics have been discussed for decades, and the conversations stubbornly refuse to go away. Today, I want to talk about those exact kinds of weapons: genetic, climatic, and psychotronic. These are the three big boogeymen that some call stupid myths, while others declare them the greatest threat to humanity. And you know what the most curious part is? The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Want to dive into more topics that are off the record? Then it's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button and smash like. Otherwise, this video will vanish into obscurity as quietly as the reports on secret military experiments. When we hear genetic weapon, it sounds like something straight out of a comic book. A villain releases a virus that only targets people with a specific blood type. Funny? A little. Until you remember that scientists already know how to edit DNA with CRISPR, treat diseases before they manifest, and create viruses in a lab. And if you can heal, you can also do the opposite. The idea is simple: create a pathogen that will seek out specific genetic markers. Some people drop with a fever, while others go about their lives completely unaffected. A military dream. No destruction, no radioactive wastelands, just a quiet and highly selective genocide. Eco-friendly, so to speak. An example? In the early 2000s, media outlets reported on alleged research in South Africa that supposedly explored biological weapons targeting specific ethnic groups. In the US, the hypothetical danger of ethnic biobombs was discussed. Congress even held hearings on the topic. And what about the collection of genetic data for science? China has been accused of mass DNA collection, and the US has been accused of funding suspicious labs overseas. Of course, everyone swears it's purely for medicine with no military undertones. Right, we believe them. The temptation is obvious. Why send 1,000,000 soldiers into battle if you can create a virus that only works on your intended target? It's the dream of every general and the nightmare of anyone who understands how vulnerable human biology truly is. It's no wonder that discussing these things publicly is almost taboo. Because to admit the possibility of genetic weapons is to admit that a technology capable of erasing an entire nation without even touching its neighbors could exist in the world today. And, strangely enough, that sounds far too plausible to just laugh off and forget. If genetic weapons sound like science fiction, then climate weapons sound like a conspiracy theory for people who blame the government for bad weather. It's raining? Must be the CIA. That's the general idea. But the concept of manipulating weather and climate for military purposes has been around for a long time. And the most interesting part? International treaties officially ban it. Which means if something is prohibited, someone, at some point, must have at least tried. History has a clear example. During the Vietnam War, the US ran Operation Popeye. Aircraft dispersed chemical agents to seed clouds and trigger massive downpours, turning enemy supply routes into impassable mud. So, weather was literally used as a weapon. It was 21st century shamanism, but with planes and chemicals. Later, rumors swirled around projects like HARP in Alaska, a massive array of antennas that conspiracy theorists claimed could trigger earthquakes, steer hurricanes, and even control mines. Scientists wave it off. It's just for ionospheric research. Sure, just research. The kind that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Who doesn't love an expensive toy with no practical application? The idea of climate weaponry is absurdly tempting. Imagine, instead of bombing cities, you simply give your enemy a multi-year drought, or a flood, or a hurricane timed perfectly to destroy their harvest. And you always have a convenient alibi. Who, us? It's just nature. It's no surprise that as early as 1977, the UN enacted the Environmental Modification Convention, ENMOD, explicitly banning the use of weather-altering technology for military purposes. Because even if it's mostly theoretical, the fact that nations felt the need to ensure against it speaks volumes. The irony is that now, every hurricane, every flood, and every abnormal heat wave comes with a whispered question. Is this climate change, or is it someone's very clever military experiment? And now, let's talk about the conspiracy theorists' absolute favorite, psychotronic weapons. This is where imagination runs wild. Rays that control your brain, zombification guns for the population, voices in your head that make you love the government. Sounds like a joke from an old comic book, right? It does. And that's precisely why the topic is so popular. It straddles the line between the ridiculous and the terrifying. The core idea behind psychotronic weapons is the belief that you can influence the human psyche using electromagnetic waves, infrasound, or some other invisible technology. And we have to admit, some of this isn't pure fantasy. For example, acoustic cannons, RADs, are very real. They're used for crowd control. Directed sound at specific frequencies causes people intense pain, nausea, and an overwhelming desire to flee. It's not telepathy, of course, but it's a good start for a weapon of the future. There is also research on the effects of infrasound or electromagnetic fields on the body. Some experiments have shown that low-frequency sound can induce anxiety, hallucinations, or a feeling of a presence nearby. So technically, yes, you can affect the brain, but we're still a long way, thankfully, from a remote control for human consciousness. However, there are always far more rumors than facts. In Russia in the 90s, there was intense speculation about psychotronic weapons supposedly being developed in military labs. In the US, members of Congress have received letters from citizens convinced the government is targeting them with microwaves. And the number of stories about secret experiments on soldiers is countless. Why is this topic considered taboo? Because even simply acknowledging the possibility that such a weapon could exist opens a Pandora's box. Mind control isn't just a weapon of mass destruction. It's the ultimate dream of every dictator. The irony is that the more officials dismiss it, the more suspicion grows. When the conversation turns to genetic, climate, or psychotronic weapons, the official response is always the same. Nonsense. Myths. Conspiracy theories. They say it with a straight face, as if we're discussing flying unicorns. But here's the problem. Nobody ever banned unicorns with an international treaty. Yet ethnic biobombs and environmental warfare? Those are explicitly prohibited by conventions like the NMOD. So, the topic is clearly not as fairy tale as they'd have us believe. Why are these discussions practically taboo? First, because the ideas themselves are too dangerous. Imagine someone getting inspired and deciding to experiment for real. The second reason is the threat of mass panic. It's much easier to say, this doesn't exist, than to explain that a weapon capable of killing millions without a single shot is theoretically possible. People are already afraid of GMOs and microwaves. The last thing they need is a zombification ray or a virus for one nation. Then there's the political angle. This is all tangled up in state secrets. If a country admits it's working on anything like this, it would trigger an international scandal, a new arms race, and a modern-day Cold War. So it's easier to stamp everything top secret and feed the public statements like, "We are for peace throughout the world." Finally, there's the simple human factor. These technologies are too seductive. By military logic, they're the perfect weapon, invisible, deniable, and utterly devastating. Just blame a storm or an epidemic for wiping out your enemy. And who could ever prove otherwise? And if you add mind control to the mix, you might not even need to spend bullets. So it's no wonder talking about this out loud is almost indecent. Because behind the myths, there might be a truth. And in this case, the truth is far more terrifying than any conspiracy theory. So, we've walked through the three most terrifying types of weapons that we're supposedly not meant to talk about: genetic, climatic, and psychotronic. The irony is that they all exist in a hazy space between science fiction and reality. On one hand, no one will ever give you a PowerPoint presentation at a defense expo titled, "Here's our latest weather control cannon." On the other hand, international bans, strange black budget projects, and persistent leaks stubbornly remind us that there's no smoke without fire. Humanity, it seems, is always driven to invent something even more effective and even more terrifying than anything that came before. If the doomsday weapon of the past was the nuclear bomb, today we're talking about technologies that can operate more quietly, more selectively, and most frighteningly, more deniably. Because you can hide from a missile in a bunker, but you can't hide from a virus in your own DNA or a voice in your head. Of course, it's convenient to write it all off as myths and conspiracy theories. It makes it easier to sleep at night. But the question remains, what if even a fraction of it is true? What if, right now, technologies are being tested somewhere that could erase entire nations, induce a continent-wide drought, or turn crowds of people into obedient puppets of someone else's will? And that's when the real fear sets in. Not a fear of the technologies themselves, but a fear that humanity will create them anyway. Because history has shown us one undeniable truth. If a weapon can be imagined, it will eventually be built. The only questions are, who will do it first and for what purpose? So maybe the only way to comfort ourselves is to pretend none of this exists. But you know what? After our conversation today, that's probably not going to work.